Hello, everybody, and welcome to Pacific Opera Victoria's online Inside Opera. Like everybody else, we are more or less confined to quarantine and observing all the protocols as they become announced to us. But we certainly still want to be in communication with our audience, and we deeply appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. Let us apologize first in advance for any internet instability that may occur. At the moment, the Wi-Fi waves are pretty occupied, so sometimes there might be a glitch in sound or audio, but we will persevere. Everybody is, as they say, in the same boat. Now, my friend Timothy Vernon and I, our artistic director of Pacific Opera Victoria, are here today to talk to you about our desert island operas. It's always something that we get asked, and I'm sure everybody out there gets asked it too. What are your favorite operas? Or even more difficult, what is your favorite opera? So just to emphasize that these are the 5 operas that each of us came up with for today. It could change tomorrow. And I'll tell you my own personal criterion before I turn you over to Timothy. And that was simply this. I thought, why not choose 2 operas that are absolutely dear to me, that I've known for a long time, that I'm close to, that would be a comfort to me because of our familiarity, were I to be stranded on a desert island, where I would get the scores, the piano, the television screen, the DVD, I don't know. But we'll assume we'll solve that by the time we get to our desert island. So I thought, choose 2 operas that are old friends that you'd want to be with. And then I thought, well, why not choose 2 operas that I know and really like and love and have worked with, but I'd still like to dig a little bit deeper and discover more about them. So I chose 2 like that. And then finally, one that I really need to get to know a lot better, a challenge. So that ended up being my personal set of criteria for this little interview, or this little program for you. So I'd like to introduce now our wonderful artistic director, Timothy Vernon, who has had an awful lot more experience with opera than I have, and from a completely different point of view. And I'll ask him to introduce his choices. Timothy.
Thank you, Robert. Well, you know, your criteria are clear and typically thoughtful, typical of you. They're thoughtful criteria. I maybe didn't think as profoundly about this question, except to respond now maybe to what you've said. I'd be a little wary of bringing, it's like wanting to be friends with somebody but not knowing her very well. I mean, I wouldn't want to get stuck with her on a desert island and find there was no compatibility in the end. So I would worry about taking things I wasn't sure of, because I'd worry about blowing a couple of opportunities on something that might exhaust itself. That's not a critique of you, it's just to explain how I think a little differently. And mine basically are, well, yeah, they're all old friends more or less, but they're friends that have some depth to them. They are not superficially entertaining choices, but they are choices that I find nourishing. They're operas that when I go back to them, I learn more, I find more in them. And there are operas that I think, at least in 2 or 3 cases, where, as you say, there are things unresolved about them in my own imagination. So I could imagine delving and having the opportunity at the time, as we are all now in this, in a way, we're on a desert island, aren't we, right now? I wouldn't want it to last, just as I wouldn't want this to last. And when you say go to a desert island, the implication is what, forever? This is all you're going to get a chance to hear? I like to think not. I'd like to think of being rescued after a suitable time and being able to open up the 400 years of opera history that have fascinated me.
I feel exactly the same way. And if we were asked the 5 operas we would like to bring to a desert island where we were going to live the rest of our lives, I honestly think I would say I wouldn't take any, because within a few months at the most, I think we would start resenting the ones that we'd chosen on behalf of the ones that we didn't choose. But let's just hope that neither of us is, in fact, ever stranded alone on any desert island. We are neither of us the most practical of nature survivors. And I think that not being able to order things.
You said a lot right there, Robert. You know that.
Well, I'm thinking of those shows like Survivor, where people have to live out in the Yukon and live on the land. I don't think I'd be able to do that for very long.
I think that would make a great show, you know. You and I?
A very entertaining show, perhaps.
What is wild?
I'm the person who decided never to rent or buy a place that wasn't within easy walking distance of 7-Eleven, don't forget.
Ah, yes. Well,
You weren't.
no.
Now, Timothy, I'd like to invite you to give us your first choice and say a few words about it.
Well, my first choice is a kind of an inevitability for me, because it was the first opera to which I had any kind of profound exposure. And it's by Mozart. And from the age of about 5, I was devoted to Mozart to a point of obsession. I remember my maternal grandmother finding me in the living room next to the big record player, which is what we used to call it, with its single giant speaker, sobbing my eyes out while listening to the slow movement of Mozart's clarinet concerto. She was very concerned about me and took it to my parents and wondered whether that was an indication of some sort of mental problem that I was having. Of course, I wasn't having a problem. What I was doing was reacting directly, as a child does, to Mozart's apparent ability to encompass, from a more or less innocent point of view, almost the entirety of human experience. I know that sounds very high-flown, but I know at that age, I sense in that music a whiff of what it is to be mortal. And that surely is the thing that underlies all of our lives and which gives it an extra resonance. And I found that in this music. So the opera, which gave this to me, which includes a lot of flash and fire and some humor, which is very typical of Mozart, is Don Giovanni. And for the entirety of the 19th century, it was considered the greatest of all operas from most sources. And it has, as a drama, everything. It's become problematic because its thematic and its plot and its story involves something that we now consign to the Me Too movement. Don Giovanni is a seducer, if not a rapist. And in the end, he gets his comeuppance, of course, by being dragged down to hell. I find Mozart's writing in this is so flawlessly dramatic and wonderful and evocative. I think the first scene, Leporello starts complaining about the routine of his daily life as a servant. And then within a couple of measures, Mozart transitions in the same tempo. When you hear the scene, and if there's a sudden accelerando right there, you know the conductor doesn't understand it. In the same tempo, out comes Donna Anna, fleeing from Don Giovanni, who's pursuing her. And then what happens? The commendatore comes out, and they have a duel, and the commendatore is fatally wounded. Leporello comes. There's this fabulous quartet at the end of the first scene, which again is often taken way too slow. And it's just such a great dramatic musical accomplishment. Supreme creativity, supreme inspiration. I love it. The other scene, of course, is the end of the opera. And that's when we know a little bit about Mozart's history. So when he was a teenager, his future friend Schikaneder showed up in Salzburg with his traveling troupe, and they gave a performance of Hamlet. And Mozart was transfixed by the sound of the ghost's voice coming from below the stage, you know, when he makes Hamlet. Swear, he says. And of course, Mozart was thrilled by this, and it stuck with him. And so we get an echo of that youthful experience when Mozart has the infernal chorus from below the stage thumping away, and the music suggests the flames and smoke emanating from wherever, you know, Giovanni's going to be dragged down to. It's a spectacular ending to the opera. Of course, it isn't the real ending, but it was the way in which the 19th century thought it should end. I mean, I have spent a lot of my life idolizing Gustav Mahler, and of course, he was a great conductor, and as the artistic director of the Vienna Opera House, no less, the Staatsoper, it was his decision to end the opera when Don Giovanni goes down to hell. And of course, that's not characteristic of the work that Mozart wrote or of Mozart's thinking, which was very 18th century. So we have this wonderful kind of apotheosis at the end of the remnants of the plot and all the characters coming together in a G major that's so gloriously Mozart, and reminds us that it is a G major opera. It started that way, it ends that way. It's the final scene, to me, always lives in my imagination.
Wonderful. Now, I love that opera too. And I want to reassure anyone watching that Timothy and I did not compare notes or converse really about this project at all. But my first choice too, one of my closest and dearest friends, is also a Mozart opera. And it's not one that I've known since childhood. That would be The Magic Flute, but this one even is my own close personal favorite of Mozart's. And this one was a victim of the 19th century in a different way. Many composers, including Beethoven, really didn't get this opera, I don't think. They certainly didn't like it. And even today, it's sometimes viewed as a rather frivolous little comedy of manners. I think it is much, much more than that. Although it is, as you said of Don Giovanni, it's very, very funny from time to time. And the opening scene is quite funny. But it doesn't take long to indicate a certain depth of thinking and musical characterization and seriousness. And this is, of course, Così fan tutte, the last of the three collaborations between Mozart and Lorenzo da Ponte. And the only, sorry, I shouldn't say that, the second of two completely original texts that da Ponte created. The other one had been a failure, so he was wary of doing that again. Now, on the surface of things, basically, it's full of almost all the operatic absurdities that make some people suspicious of opera. The idea that two young men can put on disguises and then come back into the home of their two girlfriends and not be recognized. We just have to accept that as an operatic convention, and it, for heaven's sakes, a Shakespearean one. And they woo each other's love interests. And they do this to basically to win a bet that they've waged with their older and wiser, or perhaps more cynical friend, Don Alfonso. And they do this with the wiser, perhaps more cynical maid of the two sisters, Despina. Now, all the way through, not just at the end, not just at the beginning, all the way through, there's, I think, a profound illumination of the nature of love, the questioning nature of love, the insecurities and unsureties and uncertainties of love, and the way that we can be scorched by these emotions, particularly when we haven't really taken the time to understand them. I've always gotten the feeling that however much Mozart may have understood that we sometimes fall in love with love, even that can be quite painful for the people experiencing it and quite illuminating. So Così fan tutte is, to me, of all the Mozart operas, the one most likely to make me cry. And it's also, as far as I'm concerned, like Don Giovanni, a very, very difficult opera to put on. You can't really get away with any substandard singing. And as Timothy said about Don Giovanni, you can't get away with personalizing your preferences for tempos. You can't take some of it slow and some of it fast. You can't rush. It's got to be absolutely perfectly paced. Otherwise, it can seem long. And notice I said seem. It isn't a long opera, but it's such a profoundly touching one. And every one of the characters, even Don Alfonso, but certainly Despina and all four of the lovers, benefits enormously from the way that they are musically characterized. I would also add that Così fan tutte, and for that matter, The Marriage of Figaro, as well as Don Giovanni, ends with a kind of précis, a kind of epilogue. Again, quite Shakespearean. And directors today are fond of indicating to us as an audience that perhaps when the couples reunite after all the intrigues have been revealed, that they actually go back, they go to their new pairings rather than their original ones. And my feeling about that is we've worked that out before the second act is even midway through. We'll be able to sort it out at the end. We don't need directors to sort of spoon feed us what the opera has to say. And perhaps they don't know. And so why should we know? So that is one of my two close friends amongst the operas. I'm just going to go ahead with the other one before I turn you back to Timothy. The other close personal friend is one of the shortest operas, and it's one of the ones where there is not a dull bar. And it is another one that is a famous tearjerker. And it is the perennial favorite, La Bohème. I don't think I'd want to be anywhere without La Bohème for an appreciable amount of time. And this is where I say it's got nothing to do with anybody asking what are the greatest operas. That's well above my pay grade anyway. And La Bohème as a perennial favorite is often a little bit underrated as to its qualities. And it's a story told just wonderfully. And perhaps one of the reasons I like it in the same way, sort of, that I like Così fan tutte, is because so much of it is just everyday young people having fun. It's funny, it's full of youthful energy, it's full of optimism and hope. And it forces you to concede that there is such a thing as love at first sight, and deep love at first sight. However, things go wrong for the Bohemians, the young people, and of course it ends very tragically with the death of the beautiful Mimi. And that, of course, is all the more profound and all the more disturbing because of all the happiness that's recalled during the last scene. Themes from earlier in the opera where all the guys are getting together with their girlfriends, are having fun. Those themes are brought back, and it's all the more poignant during a time of sadness to recall times of happiness. So I'd have my old buddies Così fan tutte and La Bohème with me. There are many wonderful passages of music from both of my comfort operas. My choice for Così fan tutte would probably align with almost everybody's, the Heavenly Trio from the first act, where the girls and a seemingly genuine Don Alfonso are saying goodbye to the two soldiers. From La Bohème, there are many choices. My favorite one was once described by conductor Leslie Ujeda as one of the greatest achievements in Western civilization, and that is the love duet at the end of Act 1, O Soave Fanciulla. Now, enough from me. Let's turn our attention back to Timothy Vernon, who's now going to tell you about his next desert island opera. Timothy.
Well, before I do, Robert, I have to react to some things you've said. Western civilization includes quite a pile. So I found that kind of fascinating. But I also wanted to say, I completely understand your choice of Così fan tutte, certainly as a musician. It was, as you know very well, Richard Strauss's favorite opera, not just of Mozart, whom he adored, in fact, idolized, but it was his favorite opera. And Strauss's connection to Mozart has always fascinated me. And just as an aside and a crazy footnote, wouldn't you be interested, as I am, to hear the Strauss version of Idomeneo?
Absolutely.
Because apparently it includes like 20% Strauss, which is entirely fascinating. Anyway, and as for La Bohème, I completely understand that choice too. Here's my caveat. I've toured it and conducted it maybe 250 times. So it's not that a work of art is exhaustible, it isn't. But there comes a point with a work where you feel you've plumbed as many depths as you are capable of plumbing.
Understood.
So I think my next choice, I've been sort of working chronologically a bit, is insofar as Giovanni is a dramma giocosa, which we mustn't forget in thinking about it, the giocosa part. I've chosen a comedy from the late 19th century, and this is Giuseppe Verdi's Falstaff. Merry Wives of Windsor is generally considered by Shakespeareans to be his feeblest effort, or at least the least interesting of his great dramas and comedies. I think what makes this spectacular is the friendship between Verdi and Boito. He got to know Boito, Argeo Boito, himself a composer, younger generation, an author and a composer. Boito, combed Renaissance Italian literature, which is voluminous, to find verbal equivalents for all of Shakespeare's wonderful invention. Because even in Merry Wives of Windsor, Shakespeare's verbal wit does not let up for a second. And you have these marvelous displays of, like fireworks displays of sheer language. And Boito, as a younger man, found equivalents for Verdi. Verdi loved Shakespeare all his life. He had plans to set things like King Lear, and many of us wish he had. But he had never worked with an Italian equivalent to Shakespeare's virtuosity. And this is something that Boito supplied him with. So in Falstaff, we hear a very different Verdi, a recognizable Verdi, but not a Verdi we've ever heard before. And this is a very old man, his last completed work. And he discovers what is essentially a whole new idiom, deft, quick, but sure-footed, and complex. He's not afraid of counterpoint, which is not something we think of the middle Verdi being interested in at all, with the simple melodies or simply beautiful and inspired melodies of great genius and their simple accompaniments. There is a novel by the Austrian Franz Werfel, he who married Gustav Mahler's widow, Alma, and he wrote a marvelous book. It's called, in German, Verdi Roman der Oper, which I guess in English is Verdi novel of the opera, or story of the opera. And the central character is Verdi, and it's set in that hiatus between Simon Boccanegra and Otello, which was about a 10-year gap, when Verdi seemed to have run out of steam. And Werfel's very interesting thesis is that he felt oppressed by the growing obsession in Europe with Richard Wagner, and that he felt he was becoming old hat, that he couldn't compete. Wagner was taking over. The whole of the youth movement was fascinated by Wagner, as was Boito. And so Werfel portrays Verdi as trying to find himself, in the course of which Werfel goes back to Monteverdi in Venice and gives you a whole panoply. And it's quite fantastic. And of course, it's not true. It is a novel, after all, that Verdi finally gathers up his strength to go and visit Wagner, who is in, of course, is in Venice. And he goes, and this wonderful portrayal of him arriving at the place where Wagner was staying, which is now, as those of you who've been to Venice know, is the Casino of Venice. And he goes to the door, not on the canal, but at the back. And the doors open and people are streaming out, many of them in tears. What has happened? Wagner has just died. So in this novel, Verdi misses Wagner by minutes, even though he's heard echoes of the performance Wagner gave of his own C major symphony in the theater, which is kind of fascinating. Anyway, that's all footnote to Falstaff. Falstaff is inexhaustibly rewarding as a composition. It has a cornucopia of fabulous melodies. It's got great arias. It's got great scenes. And then, of course, it has the humongous finale, this fugue set to the text, tutto il mondo è burla, the whole world is a farce. And I find it heartwarming, exhilarating, vivifying. You know, it's a terrific gift. Verdi gave us so much, and here at the very end of his life, he gives us this magnificent masterpiece. So that would be my number 2 choice, chronologically speaking, for this purported desert island.
Well, thank you very much, Timothy. I have such fond memories of the Pacific Opera production of Falstaff. And of course, it's a fantastic work too. Quite possibly, I remember somebody writing it is the single greatest Italian comic opera not written by Mozart. I guess.
I think that's good. I think that's good.
So the next opera on my list is the first of 2 that I know and have played, in fact, under your baton, and love and have loved for many years. I'm not quite so familiar, not quite so so thoroughly acquainted with them as I am with the first 2. So I'll begin with this one. And you mentioned Strauss and Mozart, and usually people think of Strauss's most Mozartian work as being Rosenkavalier. But the one that I love the most, and I will add this little codicil. I think it's about 10 minutes too long at the end. But I'm thinking about that about more and more operas, to be perfectly honest. So if we can add a cutting room floor to our desert island, that would be helpful. Anyway, this is the wonderful Ariadne of Naxos that Pacific Opera has produced twice. And it is, to me, one of the most enchanting operas that I've ever heard. And I love both of them, the Vorspiel, or the prologue, and then the formal opera itself, the opera seria. Strauss and the great Hugo von Hofmannsthal collaborated on this sort of Molierian story with a little bit of backstage intrigue. And the characters, again, I find so deeply etched as human beings, even though they're not really meant to be. Many of them are types. They're commedia dell'arte types, or they're theater types, opera types, the prima donna, the temperamental tenor, etc. And I would never have known this unless you told me, but one of the most petulant exchanges takes place between the wig maker and one of the prima donna opera singers, and it's taken directly from somebody's account of being rebuffed by Beethoven for work that was considered shoddy by the composer, but perfectly professional to the practitioner. Anyway, that's a little bit of a footnote as well. The opera is everything to Ariadne of Naxos. It's got the most profoundly touching moments between Zerbinetta, who is the leader of the comics, the characters we would consider commedia dell'arte, stock Italian kind of roles, and the incredibly impassioned young composer, played by a female singer in the manner of Cherubino, who is so serious about his art and takes himself in it so seriously, but in the most touching way. And we see in this duet the first sort of inkling that there might be something pleasurable in the world of physical affection as well as the world of the spirit and the mind. So that is one of my favorite passages from the whole opera. And also, when we begin the opera part, I should explain to anybody who's not familiar with this work that the whole first act takes place in the home of a very wealthy aristocrat, and he is hosting a sort of dinner and party, and there are going to be two entertainments, one a bunch of clowns, and then the other a serious opera based on a Greek myth, and then there will be fireworks. As I imagine often happens at these events, there's a lot of drinking going on, and the dinner party is going on too long, so he finally makes the announcement through his major domo that in fact the two entertainments are going to have to occur at the same time, which is catastrophic to the young composer, but incredibly entertaining to us. So amongst all of these fantastic set pieces in it, then a great aria given to the composer about art and music being the greatest of the arts, a wonderful catalog aria given to Zerbinetta about all the men she's loved and everything they promised her, and she believed every one of them to be a true love as she saw them approach. Those are fantastic things to look out. But the opera seria itself, the second section of the evening's entertainment, begins with Ariadne having been abandoned on the island of Naxos and awaiting death. All she wants is death. And she's guarded over by three nymphs. And yes, all of the singers I've worked with who played these parts call them the nymphos. And they look after her and wait for her to find something that can bring her back to life rather than just the longing for death. And she wakes up and she sings the most beautiful aria, which is kind of like a duet with the French horn. Strauss's father was a horn player. And I think almost nobody I can think of has written so beautifully for the horn. And that was probably the section of music I love the most from Ariadne of Naxos. I like the fact that she gets hooked up with a tenor, but there are passages between Bacchus and Ariadne towards the end of the opera that I feel overstate the case. But maybe if I had this on a desert island, I could learn to love them as much as I love the beginning of the opera. So, Timothy, thank you for introducing me to this work. It's been 21 years now, and I like it more and more every time I listen to it. Over to you, Maestro.
Well, I couldn't agree more about Ariadne. It used to be that when I was asked the question, what is your favorite opera? That would spring immediately to mind. It would be Ariadne. And I haven't come away from that. It's just that when you're young, you can have a favorite something. But when you have a lifetime of experience in the huge 400-year history of opera, you kind of lose track of favorites. It's like having more than one child. You learn to love all your children, no matter how many you have. That's how I think. So I agree completely about Ariadne. My next choice, and I'm going chronologically, my next choice is Four for the Price of One. And you can tell right away from that I am speaking about Der Ring des Nibelungen by Richard Wagner. It is, without any question, like it or not, one of the seven wonders of the Western musical world. It's inexhaustibly interesting if you can get over yourself and accept some of the basic premises involved. This is a work that took Wagner 28 years to compose. He began with sketching the texts. He worked in reverse order from the fourth to the first in terms of devising his own libretti, which he did. He wrote everything himself. In doing so, he drew on the Eddas and a lot of German and Norse mythology, refashioned it, and tried in his way to recreate a German literary style from the Middle Ages. Stabreim, which is internal rhymes in a shorter line, and he tried to write the whole thing more or less from that point of view. He then turned to composing it, having completed the text, which he read to friends on several occasions in different cities, he then started to compose it. And right away with Rheingold, it's a completely different Wagner. It's a different voice. His web of musical ideas, which have become known as leitmotifs or leading motives, which he himself called motives of remembrance and anticipation, are become immediately foreground. So you get a musical tag to hang on to who's who and what's going on and who's feeling what and how they're connecting. And of course that allows for an enormous complexity going on through the ring, because these musical ideas accumulate meaning as the characters have their experiences and as they grow as characters. It's an astonishing and almost inexhaustible accomplishment. I think my reason for wanting to include it is that when I said inexhaustible, I meant it. There really are levels of meaning in it, as in so many works of art that may not have been entirely conscious to the composer, but he was funneling so much of what he aspired to and so much of what he knew. And it's a compendium and a kind of summation of so much that characterizes the 19th century. There is, for those of you interested, an absolutely marvelous essay by Thomas Mann. It's called Die Leiden und Größe Richard Wagners, Wagner's Greatness and Sorrows. And it's absolutely worth a read because it takes you inside what all this meant in the 19th century. And of course, it's an inexhaustible piece too from the point of view of production, because as much as it means, no one production will ever reflect everything that's in it. And so we have a long history of directors and producers trying to present how they see the work and what its meaning should be. And that's led to an enormously wide variety over a century and a bit of presentation, some of them famous, some of them infamous. It takes a certain kind of singing. People always say, isn't it incredibly hard to sing? The answer is not really, because the right voice can do it. And Wagner was writing for a kind of voice, which by writing for it, he kind of summoned into being as well. That's typical of composers, after all. You know, Debussy more or less inventing the saxophone. He didn't, but he gave it a place and a focus. And so Wagner, for the voices that he wrote for, creating the big dramatic, yes, there was some history in the 19th century, but the big dramatic Wagnerian voice was a creation, and those who can do it don't find it difficult. And some of the greatest Wagnerians are the ones with the greatest techniques, where you don't see the technique, you don't see them trying. Think of Birgit Nielsen. I mean, I've stood next to her and talked to her and everything else, but watching her in rehearsal, you never see her breathe, and yet out comes this astonishing sound that's like the beacon of a lighthouse sweeping around the room, and when it hits you, you're nailed to your seat. This is something that Wagner is kind of a byproduct of what Wagner wrote and created, the idea of finding these voices that can make it. And then, of course, his treatment of the orchestra. He invented instruments, the so-called Wagner tubas, which are in the orchestra as a kind of in between the French horns and the trombone section. So the trumpets we think of as sopranos, and the French horns, okay, kind of mezzos. The Wagner tuban are kind of baritonal tenor range, and they're fantastic color, and they give a kind of density and weight and heft to the orchestral sound. And of course, the idea of Wagner's orchestra, which is huge, he stipulates, for example, 16 first violins, 16 second violins. You get the idea, it's enormous. And so to find the voices that can not only cut through or even ride this enormous ocean of sound is fantastic. And another thing about Wagner is that he created his own theater to perform this work in. There wasn't one that he felt was adequate. So he designed a festival theater in Bayreuth, in this little town of Bayreuth, which is a model of a certain kind of acoustic. It's created so that the orchestra pit goes down in layers, and the orchestra sits below. You don't see the orchestra. And then there's a kind of cover called the mystische Decke, the mystic cover, or is it the mystische Abgrund that it actually covers? But there is a cover which funnels the sound down and up so that the sound in the hall seems to come from everywhere at once. and leaves the voice unencumbered by either light from the stage or a wall of sound coming directly up out of the pit. It's itself a work of genius. And I don't know why subsequently architects haven't glommed onto this and figured out that it makes for an incredible experience in the audience. But we're a little bit away from the Ring itself as a work. It's huge. We don't even see human beings until the second part, the Die Walküre. Everybody knows the Ride of the Walküre, and if you haven't heard it, you've probably seen Apocalypse Now, and there it is. Very well played. I can't remember the orchestra that was used on that tape. And then Siegfried. Now, here's an interesting thing. Wagner stopped, having written the second act of the third opera, namely Siegfried. He stopped for 12 years. Was he inactive in that time? No. He wrote Tristan und Isolde and Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. Themselves incredible masterworks. And when he came back to begin again to finish the Ring, he started with Act 3 of Siegfried. And we have, again, a completely different voice from the earlier parts of the Ring, a voice that has become even more adept at working the orchestra, at making this dense web of sound, at finding lines and phrases, at finding connectivity with the motifs that he'd already invented and adding some to them. And so Act 3 of Siegfried involves the sun coming up and Brunhilde waking up as a human, having gone to sleep, just like Sleeping Beauty, having been awoken now as a human and finding human love in her hero, Siegfried. And this is a fantastic act, again, in the Ring. And they find each other, and the sense of their attraction, their love, which is deeply erotic, as well as anything else, is such that George Bernard Shaw once remarked, "We're so glad at the end of Siegfried because we feel that the curtain has come down just in time." So then comes Götterdämmerung, which is kind of he writes the end of this cycle. We must remember that the Nordic gods are not eternal. They're not like Judeo-Christian heaven. These gods have a cycle. They have a lifetime, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Götterdämmerung presents the end. In fact, in an early set of writings for the Ring, of the text for the Ring, he has Brunhilde say, "I saw the world end." Because what she does at the end is ride her horse right into this cosmic flame that is consuming the whole world, gods included, and Valhalla. It's an astonishing piece, and it's an enormous musical and spiritual journey. And if you give yourself to it with open heart and open mind, there are rewards that are unparalleled anywhere else in music.
Absolutely. I concur completely. It's interesting also that you pointed out that we don't actually meet any humans until Sieglinde and Siegmund, Hunding, in the Die Walküre.
That's right.
And so that's a whole 2.5-hour opera with no humans in it. Only gods and Nibelungens and the like Rhine Maiden. It's a fantastic work. And the no humans part, it's an interesting segue into what I'd like to present next. And I'm going to add one little thing also about this. Some of my choices are based on the fact that they represent periods in my life that I think of very, very fondly. And now we're going back to 1993, the beginning of 1993, and that wonderful adventure of putting on a wonderful production, actually, of Benjamin Britten's A Midsummer Night's Dream, one of my absolute all-time favorite pieces, and I have to say my single favorite Shakespeare opera. Quite possibly because Benjamin Britten plumbs the darker elements of that story. We don't come out of A Midsummer Night's Dream with the delusion that the forces of the supernatural are always benign. They're sometimes quite malevolent. And the dark music that Benjamin Britten conjures up through the most interesting of means to create a sound world for the fairies, Oberon and Titania, their feud or their confrontation, and their hench fairies, if I could call them that. They each have their own band of fairies. The music that is created for the world of the fairies, for the world of the supernatural, doesn't sound like anything else, not only that I've heard before in any other work, but in the rest of the opera. And they I found it very unsettling in a way that has provoked interest in me in that work ever since. But we also, of course, then meet mortals. We meet the pair of lovers who are completely disentangled, and each of them has his or her own kind of motive. So again, we can recognize the world of the lovers, and there's something yearning, there's something unfulfilled about the music of the lovers until they're finally matched the way they're supposed to be because of the intervention of the world of the supernatural. You always feel that in the phrases of Lysander, they're not quite finishing, they're sort of stammering a little bit as he's trying to find the right world for himself. Demetrius, Hermia, Helena, and that has its own world as well. And then there's the rustic, comic music of the mechanicals putting on the play. And that also has its own world. But then there's a play within a play, as there is in Shakespeare's original, in which Britten conjures up yet another world of sound, that of the pastiche or parodic. I remember you telling me that the role of flute was played by somebody, I don't remember who, the role of flute was played by Peter Pears at one point or another. He sings Lysander in the recording, but the role of flute, the very comic role who doubles as Tisbe in the play within a play, gave Peter Pears an opportunity to do a fairly wicked send-up of Dame Joan Sutherland and her coloratura. And I wish so much that there was a video performance of that extant. And we actually met some people that were in that at one point or another. Do you remember John? Yeah. In any case, A Midsummer Night's Dream is both disquieting and unsettling, and also one of the most satisfying evenings of music theater that I've ever had or experienced. It also features a very interesting spoken part. It's not Sprechstimme in the way that we think of as Schoenberg. There are no pitches indicated, but the rhythms are all very clearly marked, and that is the role of Puck. And it is often given to a singer because the rhythms are quite complex. And I remember we had a member of the Cirque du Soleil, Colin Heath, playing it in 1993. I thought also very well. This is to take nothing away from the later production that Pacific Opera did, because it was enchanting as well. But if there's one voice, and perhaps this was because I was getting to know it for the first time, one voice that is so haunting, it's that of Oberon, and a passage in which he talks to Puck and gets Puck to go find flowers and herbs. And of course, Oberon understands all of the potential that these herbs have to alter the universe in its course. And it begins with, I know a bank. And
Wild time blows.
And it has the most beautiful setting. It's almost like an ornamental Purcell song, and Purcell being a composer that I think Britten understood really deeply. So that would be one of my desert island operas for sure, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And again, with such fondness for those long ago years. We had a great time doing that opera, I think. Over to you, Maestro.
Oh, Robert, you know, it's sort of like, me too, me too. Loving Britain, I think we're happy to say on behalf of Pacific Opera that no Canadian company has performed more works by Benjamin Britten, because there's no question he's a great master of this form. And Midsummer Night's Dream is a summation. I just talked about Falstaff, but I'm the first to say, in my opinion, the greatest setting of Shakespeare ever written is Midsummer Night's Dream, because Britten takes Shakespeare at his word, at his famous word, and literally looks him in the eye. He doesn't back down. It's not a translation, it's not a version, it's not an arrangement. It's an astonishing accomplishment, and you've described it beautifully. Thank you. Well, where I go next, there'll be some groans, because I'm not leaving Wagner. One of my choices would be Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. Now, you see, most of my things have gone in a slightly comic direction, if you like. I took very much to heart the fairies at the bottom of the garden aspect of Midsummer Night's Dream, which is darker and which is sort of English country mythology, and I love it. Meistersinger lands us squarely in a square, namely a medieval town square in Germany. There are no clouds of mystery around Die Meistersinger. It's very, very human. To that extent, it's almost a little bit bourgeois, but the characters and the figures are so deeply realized, so beautifully realized in the round. The Hans Sachs figure is one of the greatest accomplishments. He himself is almost Shakespearean in his dimension and his reach and what he means and what his relationships with the others mean. And that is an accomplishment. Wagner wrote his own libretti, as I already mentioned, and this one is very special. I remember my old teacher, Swarovski in Vienna. He would do that sort of thing. He'd try to get the young ones confused, and he would say things like, so what do you think is Wagner's greatest composition? And inevitably somebody would say, the Ring of the Nibelung. No! Tristan and Isolde. No! And then we'd all look very puzzled, and he'd thump the desk and say, the text for the Meistersinger of Nuremberg. And why would he say that? Because when you examine it, it's an astonishing accomplishment in literature. He is talking about the guilds from the medieval period. We're talking 15th century. And this is the time of Dürer and this kind of thing. And they had the guilds, the Meistersinger existed as guilds, and they had these very strict regulations and rules about how to write poems. If you're writing a poem on this subject, it has to have this kind of rhythm, and can be this long, and have rhymes, and do this and this and this. And Wagner describes all this in the character of one of the smaller figures, David, who's huge and wonderful, and we love him. He describes all of these rules while illustrating them. That's what's so astonishing. It's like breathtaking. It's amazing. And the music itself, so beautiful. And everybody knows at least the overture with this great marching theme and all of those things. And the fact that it's written as a demonstration and as a response to critics who said Wagner never had a proper musical training and couldn't write a fugue. So what he does do is invent these themes which go through the opera and which can fit over and around each other and make a wonderful polyphonic web. And it's not a strict fugue in the Baroque sense, but it's deeply polyphonic and understanding. And in fact, I once had another teacher who said, you know, it's so beautifully set, you can actually add the Toreador song on top and it fits. So Meistersinger von Nuremberg, it's heartwarming. And this again, Desert Island, I'm looking for things that will keep my spirits up. I'm looking for things that will reassure me about life and about human nature, about love and its capacity to overcome, and about the function of art, even I guess on a desert island, because the function of art, the relation of society to art is deep in this story and comes out in a bit of preaching at the end, which is kind of unfortunate, especially since it talks at length about German art, which sets him up for certain kinds of criticism we won't have to go into right now. But it is a deeply thought, felt, and realized idea, treatment of the themes of society and art, how they interact, and what they can and should mean for the betterment of the whole structure and the whole of society. And that's idealistic, but it's beautiful and moving, transporting in many cases, but always, always deeply, deeply human.
Thank you. Now, it's interesting to think of something that excites so many elements of our beings, the intellect, the emotions, and one very brief passage. I'm talking now about something that excites emotion very spontaneously and very thoroughly. Reminded me of when I saw on television young people responding to the Beatles back in the 60s. And it's like every fiber of their nerves was alive and frenzied with emotion. Yeah. And there is one passage in an opera that did that to me the first time I heard it. It's in Act 3 of Die Walküre, when Brunhilde has just pleaded with Wotan to not subject her to the indignity of being woken up by somebody not worthy.
Yeah.
And in the orchestral music, just as it's beginning to introduce the leitmotif associated with slumber, he relents. And you know that he's going to come, and usually he enfolds her in his arms and says he will encircle her with fire, as she has asked. And I remember it was literally like watching little children when they're overexcited, like go all like that. That's how I felt inside when I first heard that. And it has never failed me. And so bit by bit, as I've gotten to know The Ring more, that would definitely be my choice for a work to take to a desert island for present, past, and future opening up of myself. The thing I think that surprised me, having studied it in school and having been rebuffed by it, frankly, at a production of Götterdämmerung that I just wasn't ready to attend. What surprised me when I finally did start listening to it and watching it on DVDs is how completely immediate it is, almost at every point of its all of the evenings put together. That's just one intense moment, but there are so many of them. And it's also an opera that does repay study. I don't believe that it's something that you can go to see for a first time and not get something out of. It's just thorough musical genius at every point. But it does repay closer attention, study, listening to the leitmotifs. There's a wonderful recording Derek Cook put together that enables you to, he explains them, he plays them for you and then explains them. So when you go to it, you are more familiar with it. But it still works from the first minute you're exposed to it, unless you're exposed to it in a way that is not as competent as it should be on the part of the presenters. The work itself, absolutely. So I think that would probably take up most of my attention on the desert island after the needs of survival had been met. Yours.
Well, I guess this is my last of 5. And the thing is, Desert Island, I've thought about it, and I realize that I've chosen all these because of what I feel is their substance, because I feel they would sustain me over a longer period, because I already love them, but would yearn to know them in every detail. So a couple of them I've performed, of course, and that makes a difference in your attitude. But I have to say, I realize there's a slight discrepancy now between what if I were asked about my favorite 5 operas and my desert island operas. There's an odd sort of disjunct a little bit, because you brought one to the fore already in Midsummer Night's Dream, which I adore down to the ground. So you've already mentioned this last of the 5 for me, and that is Rosenkavalier by Richard Strauss. Rosenkavalier, in each case, I think I've mentioned the literary aspect, and you'll begin to realize it's important to me, this. Hugo von Hofmannsthal, along with very few other names, Da Ponte, et cetera, was one of the greatest librettists who ever wrote. And Strauss knew that he was. And in this occasion, Hofmannsthal created a portrait which could have been commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce in Vienna, because it's a demonstration of how Vienna, to this day, thinks of itself. It has so much that's K und K, Kaiserlich und Königlich, so it goes back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the jolly days of all that. And it has layers of language, from the servants to the nobility, but not just the nobility. You have the country nobility, Baron Ochs, and his particular idiom and way of speaking. Then you have the bourgeois in town and their particular way of speaking. Then you have climbing up to the court and the Marschallin and her young lover, of course, Octavian. And then the little delightful, charming Sophie, with whom Octavian falls in love and finally leaves his older lover, who's taught him everything he knows, most of it in bed, namely the Marschallin. Now, we talked earlier about Strauss and Mozart. Strauss loved Mozart, yes, he did. And Rosenkavalier is to such an extent inspired by the Marriage of Figaro, you can't even imagine. So, for example, the famous scene in Figaro where Susanna and the Countess get together to disguise Cherubino, that is the kind of birthplace of the trio in Rosenkavalier. The 2 women conspiring and this younger, the boy, essentially. Of course, their relationships have been taken 2 or 3 turns in Rosenkavalier, but the structure of that trio is basically derived from the Marriage of Figaro. And of course, the trio is one of the great set pieces and showcases and show-off pieces, if you like, for 3 sopranos, 2 sopranos and a mezzo, and for Strauss's astonishing cornucopia of ideas and his dealing with the voices, not just the one voice, the voices in the orchestra, his sense of the orchestra and the color and the things that it can achieve in terms of expressive value is unparalleled, certainly in his day and up to his life. He lived a long time. He died, what, 1949? Yeah. So he's somebody who experienced a lot in the course of the 20th century. He knew this other music. But Strauss, I didn't like Strauss, just as I didn't like Wagner when I was growing up, but I didn't understand them. I mean, I got into Wagner because I had a girlfriend in Vienna who was studying Germanistic, the study of German literature. And she was made to read all the texts that could be found having to do with the Nibelungen saga. So of course, Wagner came along in the course of her studies and she thought it was a joke and had a lot of laughs and kept showing me how stupid it was. And I read it and then I began to realize, no, there's more than just silly imitation to this. There's something going on. So the text was my way in to Wagner's Ring. It's an odd, but I give you that. Rosenkavalier, of course, the music is overwhelming. It's immediately overwhelming. It's sly, it's funny, it's voluptuous, it's sensual. Yes, you can say it's decadent in terms of what's going on, Schoenberg, 12 tones, all that stuff. But it is an amazing accomplishment. And again, Hofmannsthal behind it is I komme aus dem Staunen nicht heraus, as the Baron Ochs says. I cannot come out of my astonishment for a minute. And that's how you feel when you study this piece. It's inexhaustible. Strauss's capacity in a tiny phrase, just a turn, just a slight shift in the harmony, one note changes, and the bottom goes out of your emotional world. It's unbelievable. He was a grand master, and there's reason to think in his own tradition, in the German tradition, he was the greatest and the last from the 19th century right through, because he takes Wagner and goes another few steps. Did he have the cosmic ideals? No, he was practical. He was a businessman. He was all about earning money and getting paid and having his copyright renewed and all of that stuff. He couldn't help his genius. And genius is a small word for Richard Strauss, I find. And the subtlety and attention to detail and humanity. There is humanity. You can't imagine these characters in music without having a deep understanding of the best of human nature. And I'll leave with one little anecdote, which I find so moving. Strauss was giving a dinner party at his home in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which I've actually visited, and is across from, I don't know what it's called, the Eagle's Nest, but across from one of Hitler's bunkers overlooking the mountains there. So Garmisch-Partenkirchen, he's there. He's having dinner in his villa. A servant comes in and whispers in his ear. Strauss quietly leaves, excuses himself, and he doesn't come back. So one of the other dinner guests is starting to get worried. He goes out, he looks around, he goes in the kitchen, he asks the servants, there's no sign of Richard Strauss. And it's a balmy evening, so this guest steps out of the house and thinks he hears something. And there's a kind of a gazebo in the garden. And he goes to a summer house sort of thing. And he goes there and he hears this sound and he looks in. Strauss is sitting in the gazebo in the garden of his villa, crying his eyes out, inconsolably, because he's just been informed that Hugo von Hofmannsthal died that day. And Strauss knew in his heart he would never find a partner like that. And it's true, he didn't. On the other hand, there's a funny thing. When they came to write Die Frau ohne Schatten, which they had done together, was not a big success. And there's a letter from Strauss to Hofmannsthal saying, well, you can always write another Rosenkavalier if you can't think of anything better. Kind of brings it down to earth, I think. But Rosenkavalier, yeah, I can listen to that. It's a routine for me to listen to it around Christmas time. Don't ask why, but it's the biggest Christmas present for me is to listen to a great performance of Rosenkavalier.
Well, maybe you've introduced us to a wonderful new Christmas tradition. It's interesting and enlivening to read the correspondence of Strauss and Hofmannsthal, isn't it?
One of the greatest.
And also Boito and Verdi.
Yep.
I just wish that Da Ponte and Mozart hadn't lived in the same city. We may have had.
That's right. You're so right. I think it's wonderful, and I think they're both wonderful correspondences. But I think you learn so much from Strauss and Hofmannsthal.
Absolutely.
So much, if you really have the patience to go right through it, because they discuss so many issues. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, Hofmannsthal was a great literary genius and a great theatrical genius. He wrote all those plays and he wrote all that stuff. But in the end, Strauss is always right about how it should go.
I would imagine the same with Mozart and Da Ponte. In any case, thank you very much, all of you, for being here to listen to us. And we'll look forward to more online sessions of Inside Opera and other things that we put on. And thank you, Timothy, of course.
Oh, Robert, it's my pleasure. I mean, all that you've done to communicate with our Victoria public and with our dear family around the opera, it's, you know, you can never be repaid enough or thanked enough.
Thank you. Timothy and I have been doing this together for a large number of years. Maybe sometime I'll show you what we looked like when we first started working together. And since neither of us can actually get out and go and have our beard trimmed, it's going to be interesting to see the last few. I've resolved not to shave my beard until I can have someone do it properly. I did trim my own beard in my own bathroom in 2007, and I'm still finding whiskers on the floor, so I'm not. In any case, thanks very much, Timothy. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.